Hello, I'm Meredith Richards, President of the Virginia Rail Policy Institute. Since 2004, our nonprofit, nonpartisan public interest group has engaged in research, analysis, publication, education, and outreach to increase public understanding of freight and passenger rail and promote public policies that will secure the future of inner-city rail in Virginia. We're extremely pleased today to have with us two professionals from the Rails to Trails Conservancy, Kelly Pack and Andrea Furster, whose work in trail development and legal services for rail trails projects have been essential to many of the nation's finest recreation trails throughout the country. We're grateful also that among the Conservancy's work is the promotion of rails with trails, the coexistence of both rail operations and trail use in the same right-of-way and at the same time, as well as preserving discontinued rail lines for possible future use when designing rail trails. VRPI appreciates the environmental, recreational, and economic benefits of multi-use trails, and we congratulate Governor Ralph Northam, who only yesterday announced a proposed two-year budget that will include nearly $245 million for outdoor recreation, expanding Virginia's network of regional trails, state parks, and staffing for the Office of Outdoor Recreation. His announcement highlights 3 trail corridors identified for potential state funding, 2 of which would make use of former freight rail lines, and they would add to the 19 popular Rails to Trails projects in Virginia. Rail corridors are tempting candidates for trails because assembling a new trail corridor is daunting and expensive, but VRPI does urge caution as rail corridors were built for rail transportation, and once these corridors are lost, it will be extremely difficult to resurrect them in the future, no matter the changed circumstances that may call for their return to rail use. Once the tracks are removed and the right-of-way converted to a park or trail easement, any potential for restoration of the former rail line vanishes. Some states have established policies of rail banking of potential abandoned rail lines to preserve passenger and or freight opportunities in the future. Virginia has not yet established or codified a policy for rail banking. In 2006, it did codify a public policy declaring that the retention, maintenance, and improvement of short line corridors to be in the public interest and to be essential for the Commonwealth's economic growth and vitality. Virginia's own groundbreaking rail initiatives announced in 2019 includes the acquisition of true rail lines, one abandoned and the other underutilized, for state-sponsored passenger routes, illustrating the importance of maintaining at-risk rights-of-way for rail infrastructure and for future rail projects. In their Back to Track report published last year, the Chaddock Institute at DePaul University in Chicago reviewed 90 projects in the past 16 years involving discontinued rail lines successfully restored to service to the great benefit of the communities served. We recognize that every form of rail line may not warrant preservation or restoration, and we do not know what is to come, but what we do know is that freight and passenger demand will increase in the future, and road capacity is not likely to grow proportionately. We also know that freight railroads, while currently retention, will likely respond to future trends and expand their services accordingly in places that see little demand today. I'm going to introduce Michael Testerman, the Executive Director of the Rail Policy Institute, who will introduce our speakers. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Meredith. I'm Michael Testerman, and I lead the organization answering the phone, taking questions, and generally just being the glue that keeps us going. Our two presenters today are both affiliated with the Rails to Trails organization, and I believe Andrea Furster will be speaking first regarding rail banking. Andrea is the principal of the law firm bearing her own name, and she's the general counsel for the Rails to Trails Conservancy and has been so since 1992. You've probably read a little bit more about her background on the introductory promotion for this program, so I will leave that introduction of her and move on to Kelly Pack, who is the Senior Director of Trail Development for the Rails to Trails Conservancy, and she's done that for the past 15 years. Her work is focused on trail planning, regional trail network development, community-based trail programming, and grassroots coalition development. Kelly also leads the Rail to Trail Coalition's Conservancy's research on rails with trails and has authored its national study, which was published in 2013. She holds an MS in Recreation and Parks and Tourism Resources from West Virginia University. With that, I will turn things over to our two presenters.
Thank you, Michael.
I was about to also add, excuse me, Andrea, we will be honoring questions if they haven't been covered in the main presentation at the end of our program. And so submit them into your online tool.
Thanks. Thank you, Michael and Meredith, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen so that we can get started with our PowerPoint here. We're really thrilled to be with you today to talk about rail banking and Rails with Trails. I know we have about an hour for this meeting, and like Michael said, we'll have some time at the end of the presentation to answer some of your questions, but I understand that several of you have submitted questions beforehand, and we did our best to weave those into the presentation today. So we're excited to be able to provide some clarity around rail banking, and I'm also really thrilled about being able to share a recent study that was produced by USDOT. We co-authored the study with the Volpe Institute, and I'll review most of that in the second part of the presentation. And Andrea will be taking on the bulk of the rail banking portion of the presentation. A little bit more about us. I think the introductions were from our bios. These are here. Andrea, is there anything else that you'd like to add right now as we get started? Okay. And same for me. I think just, you can see our love for trails and rails and biking all captured in our images there. And like I said, we're really happy to be with you here today. A little bit about the Rails to Trails Conservancy. We are a nonprofit organization that was formed in 1986, and we've worked to bring the power of trails to more communities across the country, serving as a national voice for the rail trail movement. Our mission is to build a nation connected by trails. And, we do that through many avenues of our work. With more than 1 million grassroots supporters and nearly 25,000 miles of rail trails now crisscrossing the country, 3 decades of helping to build and establish a really robust connected trail network throughout the US. So this is a little bit more about what we do. We advocate for trails, and on that I'll say, our primary goal is to ensure that there is the protection and enhancement of federal funding for trails, walking, and biking, primarily through the Transportation Alternatives Program and Recreational Trails Program. We assist communities in the planning and development of trails through our portfolio of Trail Nation projects, which are a collection of regional trail networks throughout the country. we partner for trails, and in our Trail Nation work and in our flagship cross-country rail trail effort, the Great American Rail Trail, we provide assistance to local partners on the ground. We promote trails through our website and magazine, and specifically through our trail finder website, traillink.com. And we also do a lot of work to protect trails. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today through upholding rail banking as an avenue for preserving rail corridors for trail use. This is just to give you a sense of the current rail trail statistics in the US and in Virginia. So we are aware of, like I said, nearly 25,000 miles of rail trails across the US. And in Virginia, you have some really stellar rail trails and iconic rail trails that, you know, our organization often celebrates and lift up as examples. So you can see Virginia's stats there as well. And just another plug for traillink.com. It's a really great resource to find out information about open trails. This includes both rail trails and other types of multi-use trails as well. And I will send it over to Andrea to begin our presentation on rail banking. I look like I'm having some formatting issues, but we'll try to work through those if possible. This didn't show up in the practice session, but Andrea, can you?
Sure, I can cope with that.
Okay.
Thanks, Kelly. And thank you, Michael, for that introduction, and Meredith as well. I've been RTC's general counsel for nearly 30 years, and one of the focal points of my work with the Rails to Trails Conservancy has been to manage, in particular in managing its legal program, is promoting and defending the federal rail banking law. So I'm really pleased to have an opportunity to talk more about that really important law for the preservation of rail corridors for continued future use and interim use as trails. The rail banking law, I view, is one of the most important legal tools for creating rail trails that we have. And it's often called the Trails Act. I call it the rail banking law. It's been instrumental in creating some of, I think, our country's most treasured trails. It's particularly helpful in the case of very long trails. And I think the photo you see is of the Cowboy Trail, which is one of the longest trails in the country and was created through rail banking. And Rails to Trails Conservancy had a hand in facilitating the the creation of that wonderful long distance corridor. The rail banking law, as Kelly mentioned, was passed by Congress in 1983, and it was passed because Congress had recognized that as a result of the increase in the trucking industry, rail lines and freight rail service had become less profitable, and railroads were abandoning their corridors at a rapid rate and very alarming. I think the reference, the literary reference is to Humpty Dumpty that we use a lot, that rail corridors, once they are abandoned and the land is returned to other ownership and fragmented, they are literally would be impossible to recreate today, unlike the situation that existed when they were first assembled in the the 18th and 19th, or the 19th and 20th century, because our country has become so much more populous and the cost of land has so radically increased. So the law was passed to try and preserve the corridor itself, not necessarily the rails, not necessarily the ties, but the corridor, because that is the most irreplaceable piece of the rail infrastructure, and the one that is most difficult to replicate and replace. And the reason why rail banking was enacted it has to do with the situation involving rails to trails conversions before the law was passed. The problem was that became quite clear is that when an effort was made to convert a railroad corridor that had been already authorized and released from the Surface Transportation Board's jurisdiction, or at that point, the Interstate Commerce Commission's jurisdiction, it was difficult. The title issue became very problematic. Most railroads often own only a very limited property interest in a corridor. It's often an easement that's limited to railroad purposes, and under the law of many states, once a rail easement has been officially abandoned, meaning the railroad has no longer any intent to use the corridor for rail service and has taken actions to consummate that intent, it reverts or becomes the property of usually the adjoining landowners. And a rails to trails conversion that takes place post-abandonment as a result may be a situation where the railroad basically has nothing to convey. And the rail banking law solves this problem. And the important features of rail banking are set out in the slide, and there are three of them that I'm going to talk about. One is it's a voluntary process. The railroad seeking abandonment authorization has to agree to rail bank it with a willing trail manager. The other feature is that and this is of particular note to your organization, is that the voluntary agreement that if it's reached between a rail trail manager and a railroad must provide for the return of the corridor to the abandoning railroad or its successor or some other entity. If some other rail entity is interested in willing and able to provide rail service on the line. And in the meantime, and until that happens, the corridor can be used for interim trail use. And that right does allow for the removal of tracks and ties during the interim trail use. But the key feature is that the trail manager has an obligation to return the corridor to if in the event it is reactivated. And the third feature, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, is that rail banking preempts conflicting state laws. And, this feature of preemption is probably the most important feature of the rail banking law, because as I mentioned before, state laws would otherwise provide for the abandonment of any limited interest that the railroad might have. And as a result, the railroad would not have anything to convey to an interim trail manager. And what preemption does is it maintains the corridor as if it were an active rail line under the jurisdiction of the Surface Transportation Board. And the STB regulates all freight rail operations in interstate commerce. It regulates both the entry and the exit. No rail line can abandon its or discontinue rail service without the STB's permission. And during the period in which the rail line is subject to the STB's jurisdiction, any state law or principle of state law that might interfere with active rail use is preempted. It cannot operate. And that principle applies when a corridor is rail banked, that state law principles that would otherwise work in abandonment of the corridor are preempted so long as the corridor is rail banked. There's an extensive body of case law interpreting the rail banking law. And Kelly, you can advance the slide one more. That is, and I'm not going to talk about that, but I will note that we do, Rails to Trails Conservancy has a detailed publication on our website on legal issues affecting Rails to Trails conversions that you can access through our, I think it's our rail banking toolbox. But the most important case that bears mentioning here is the 1990 Persaud decision. It was the unanimous US Supreme Court decision holding that rail banking was fully constitutional. Property owners who challenge rail bank law have one and only one avenue for challenging the rail banking law, and they can file a claim for compensation, based on their view that rail banking has taken their property without just compensation. And I think the most important thing to remember about these takings claims, and a lot of people often ask us questions about them because there are many takings claims that have now been filed, is the first thing is that they are filed against the United States of America, not the railroad or the trail manager. The only relief that's available to an adjacent landowner who successfully argues that rail banking has taken their property is monetary compensation. The claims don't challenge the or affect the ability to continue to use the corridor as a trail or to develop the trail, and that the compensation is paid only by the United States and not by the trail manager or the railroad. Then we can go to the next slide, Kelly. So there are many benefits to rail banking for both railroads and trail managers. From the railroad's perspective, I think the main benefit is that the two main benefits are that they can continue to preserve the corridor for future rail service without having the responsibilities, the liability, the financial obligation or financial responsibility or the obligation to provide rail service on the line. And so that the property, and instead the property is managed by the trail manager, which does assume all that liability and financial responsibilities for that corridor until it's needed. It creates obviously goodwill for the railroad. And as a transaction, if a railroad, which is seeking to abandon a line, is interested in finding somebody else to purchase it, it's a single transaction as opposed to multiple transactions. They can sell the entire corridor and own all their interest in it in one transaction, which obviously has lower transaction costs. So the next slide shows the benefits of rail banking for the trail manager. And, there's some of the same benefits for trail managers in that it's a single transaction and they acquire that corridor from one entity, the railroad, as opposed to purchasing it from numerous adjacent landowners, which is theoretically cost savings should be a cost savings to the trail manager. But the next slide shows that I think that the most important benefit of rail banking is that it is what I call super title insurance. And that's because of the feature of federal preemption. You can go to the next slide there. As I mentioned, the rail banking law preempts any state law or state-based legal challenge that could interfere with the use of the corridor as a trail or interfere with its ability to be preserved for future railroad service. The next slide, you'll see that what the sort of how that works. And I refer to it as a trail manager's get out of court free card, because what happens often is that in any rail trail situation is that adjacent landowners believe that they have the right to own the corridor and they file a lawsuit against a trail manager. And in the case of a lawsuit filed against a rail bank corridor, we have a standard protocol that we advise managers of rail bank corridors to follow if they get sued. And that protocol is that they need to immediately remove the corridor to federal courts, file a motion to dismiss the case based on the argument that the federal rail banking law preempts the lawsuit. And the important part is it's fast, it's efficient, it's not costly, and the trail manager always wins. And that's, in contrast to a non-rail bank corridor where a lawsuit by an adjacent landowner could drag on for years, could be very, very, very costly. And the outcome really depends on the state law in any particular given state. And it's hard, it puts the corridor in limbo because essentially a trail manager who is threatened with a lawsuit and the corridor is not rail banked, it they develop and invest in the corridor at their own risk, because they might lose it at the end of the day and at the end of a very long process. And again, as I mentioned, the only recourse for adjacent landowners who want to challenge rail bank corridors is to file a claim for compensation against the United States of America, which does not threaten the trail in any way. So the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the Rails to Trails Conservancy's role. And Kelly, you can chime in here if you'd like about our early warning system and the other technical assistance that Rails to Trails Conservancy provides. If you want to, do you want to spend a minute talking about that?
Sure. So we refer to this system of notifying local communities about upcoming abandonments as our early warning system. We have a process of monitoring the Surface Transportation Board weekly and looking for abandonment exemption filings, and then notifying community members, elected officials, municipal and county planning agencies, anyone who we think might be interested in the opportunity to rail bank the corridor. We reach out to them via email, and we also have an email list that you can sign up for if you're just interested in learning about any potential abandonments in your region or state. And I can provide more information about that at the end. The technical assistance tools and resources that we have are on our website in the Trail Building Toolbox, and all of what Andrea is covering today is included in depth in some of the summaries that you see here on the screen, including the legal review that Andrea compiled a couple years ago, which is very comprehensive and kind of my go-to guide when I'm providing any type of assistance related to rail banking. It's an excellent resource and is there in our toolbox. And you can also just reach out to us. Our email will be provided at the end.
Thanks, great. And then on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about simply the role that I play as part of RTC's legal program. So the Rails to Trails Conservancy is the only national organization that regularly goes to court to defend rail trails and advance the public policy framework surrounding rail trail conversions. And no surprise, the defense of rail banking and the promotion of rail banking is an important part of that advocacy that we do in the courts and before administrative agencies, as well as before Congress. I do tell people that, in terms of getting involved in litigation, we file friend of the court briefs in support of trail managers on numerous occasions. And, please come to us if there's litigation, particularly that affects the policy principles involving Rails to Trails conversions that we can speak to knowledgeably. And, we have a protocol for participating. And if we can't participate, and I am available to talk to your lawyers or talk to you about any legal issue that comes up affecting, particularly involving rail banking or federal legal principles affecting Rails to Trails conversions. I'm next. I guess the next slide gets us into Virginia. So I'll let Kelly do that. But before I do that, I don't know, Kelly, if you want me to answer any of the questions that have come up in the chat or to wait for that later.
We could go ahead and answer some of the questions that are specifically related to rail banking. I'll address the rail with trail comment in my presentation. But no, I think these are easily addressed now. And would you like me to read them, Andrea? Or can you see them as well?
Yeah, I can see them.
Okay.
I think one question is, how do you reclaim former rail corridors for use as trails and possibly future railroads if they have not been previously rail banked? And that should have been a setup to my discussion about the importance of rail banking. It's a perfect question. Because yes, it's very, very hard. The important thing is title work. I mean, unless the railroad had acquired the corridor through basically fee simple absolute, as opposed to easements or even by simply taking adverse possession, which railroads have done from time immemorial. It's hard to acquire corridors, rail corridors as trails. That is why rail banking is so important. Let's see, the next question is, can rail banking agreements be established after a line has been abandoned if a public entity took ownership at the time of the abandonment? The answer is a qualified yes, but that's kind of rail law inside baseball, so I won't go into that. But if you have that situation, you definitely need to be advised by a qualified rail counsel who may be able to find you a way to return the corridor to the STB's jurisdiction if a public entity has owned it and thereby preserve it. But it's a little tricky and complicated.
I'll just add to the first question that in our toolbox, we address different methods of acquisition for trail use, including purchase and fee and easement and license. So there are also, many examples of rail trails that are assembled or acquired in those ways. But as Andrea's mentioned, over and over, and we'll be really emphatic about that, rail banking is the the gold standard and offers both the trail manager and the railroad the most protection.
So I'm going to skip over the question about rail service reactivation because that comes up later in our presentation, and I think we'll cover that. So I'll turn it over to you, Kelly, for this.
Great. Yeah, I just wanted to include anytime we provide these types of presentations to a specific state or region, I like to pull relevant examples. So you may be wondering if there are rail banked corridors and trails in Virginia. These are the 3 known corridors that are rail banked with open trails in Virginia. There is one more corridor that is rail banked and not yet opened as a trail, and there are a couple of corridors that are currently in process through the STB did decide to allow interim trail use, and those 2 corridors are going through the negotiation process with the railroad. So just some background for what this looks like on the ground in Virginia. And I think we're gonna then, kind of roll into reactivation here. So
I know that VRPI has a lot of interest in this topic, so we have a couple of slides that drill down into rail service reactivation issues. And I'll talk about that briefly, and Kelly will provide some specific examples. So if a corridor is rail banked, a condition of the issuance of a rail banking order is that the interim trail manager must agree to reconvey, essentially return the corridor if there is a reactivation request that's filed by a railroad. And that's the simple concept of it, but the actual mechanics of it are a little more complicated. And this case was the Georgia Great Southern Division case was the first, I think the first case that dealt with the STB really grappling with a reactivation request. And the Rails to Trails Conservancy was involved in it because it involved a corridor that RTC had brokered a conversion, Rails to Trails conversion with an interim trail manager. And the successor to the original railroad filed a reactivation request with the STB. and argued before the STB that that meant that the interim trail manager had to give the corridor back to the new railroad for free. And it ignored the fact that the interim trail manager had actually paid the railroad for the corridor and had an investment in it. And so the issue was put to the STB, you know, what does reactivation mean? And in this decision, the STB made clear that the right to reactivate was a regulatory right. All it means is that the railroad does not have to file a new application before the STB which is a very burdensome and time-consuming process, but it simply gets to be restored to its status as an active rail line, in the stroke of a pen. Basically, it's ministerial, and the STB, if a petition is issued and made to reactivate a corridor, the STB will immediately vacate the rail banking order and the corridor becomes returned to active rail service. But what it does not mean is that it doesn't deal in any way with the mechanics of how that happens in terms of, how does the corridor get reconveyed to the railroad, or does it simply get a license or a lease to allow active rail service, and any issues of compensation that's been involved. So what we have learned from this proceeding a while ago is that it's very, very important that a rail banking agreement actually address the terms and conditions governing any reactivation of rail service. And this would be pertinent particularly to Kelly's presentation about rails with trails, as we do urge that ideally the agreement contemplate that both trail use and rail service be accommodated in any reactivation scenario. The next slide also deals with another case that really that interpreted the reactivation issue. So any railroad, the STB has made clear that any railroad can reactivate rail service on the line, and it doesn't have to be just the abandoning railroad or its successor in interest. But so what happens if a new railroad enters into the scene and wants to reactivate service on a rail bank line with no contractual right whatsoever to do so. And this case made clear that the STB will very carefully review the application to make sure that the reactivation request is bona fide and that the railroad actually has some ability to, operate rail service on the corridor and to acquire the rights or property interests to do so. So Kelly, I think you're going to provide these actual examples of corridors that have been reactivated.
Yes, thanks. And I'll just note that I'm going to share a couple of examples where a rail banked corridor had a trail constructed and rail service was reactivated on a portion of that corridor. There are many examples of corridors that have been reactivated after being rail banked, but no trail was constructed. So I think, many of you may be familiar with the fact that these projects often take many years. Trail projects often take many years to design and construct because it is often challenging for local communities to, raise the funds. So because of that time-consuming process, you might have these situations where a rail-banked corridor did not go to full construction as a trail, but was reactivated for trail use. So that's part of the reason why I think that there are only a couple of examples at this point in time of reactivation. So the example that I'm sharing with you here in Pennsylvania of the Snowshoe Multi-Use Rail Trail, which was rail banked by Headwaters Charitable Trust in the 90s, and a it's a primarily an ATV use trail with hiking and biking allowed, but it was then reactivated in 2012. The railroad, R.J. Corman, reactivated a portion of the line in order to provide service to a waste to ethanol facility there. So they reactivated a portion of that 19 miles and reconstructed the rail for that facility. And what I don't know is if the ATV primary use ATV was rerouted, or if it was reconstructed next to the corridor. So that is one example. Another is of the Iron Ore Heritage Trail in Michigan. This is a much longer trail. I think it might total 30 plus miles. A portion of it is built on a rail banked corridor, and similar story where a railroad wanted to, the Rio Tinto Railroad wanted to reactivate a portion of the corridor in order to access a nickel and copper mine, and went through, similar process through the STB of filing for reactivation. The Michigan DNR is the trail manager in this instance, and they did work together to rebuild that 1.9 mile section of trail along that corridor. So that we get asked this question fairly often. And, these, like I say, are two known examples of established trail and reactivation of service, but there are about 30 other examples of corridors that have been reactivated, of rail banked corridors that have been reactivated. And I know that we have, just being cognizant of time here, about 15 minutes. So I will have to speed through our Rail with Trail portion. But we did want to address your recommended policies that were provided to us prior to this presentation, just pretty briefly, because, in terms of number one, that current and/or inactive rail lines coming up for abandonment should be rail banked. Absolutely, we agree. We really view rail banking as the best statutory tool for preserving rail corridors that would otherwise be abandoned. So 100% agree with you there. If trails are to be developed on banked or abandoned rail lines, trails should be designed, constructed, and operated in a manner that would permit resumption of future train operations. And for this, we just really want to emphasize that maintaining the linear corridor, right, and maintaining the right of way and the property interest of the right of way is the most important feature of rail banking, and that it is our best tool for preserving these corridors for future rail use. And on the third, for rail lines that are abandoned, there should be a set period of time. This would be a really wonderful goal, but whether that's, whether there's the ability to accomplish this type of policy really depends on title issues and state law. And Andrea, I didn't know if you wanted to comment any more on this piece.
The only thing I would like to say is I would be cautious about calling non-rail bank lines abandoned lines, first of all, because once a rail easement is abandoned, if it's a limited easement under state law, then it is very difficult to preserve the corridor for future rail use, even if it hasn't been used for a long period of time. So I would definitely not use that word abandoned, because that's a legal state that has to be adjudicated. And even if the corridor is not formally, even if the corridor is no longer in the STB's jurisdiction and the railroad has received abandonment authorization from the line, don't call it abandoned, because that's just red meat to adjacent landowners who may decide that they own the corridor once it's abandoned. And other than that nuance, I would say Kelly is absolutely, correct that, it all depends on state law, your ability to preserve that corridor for future rail service use. Yeah. And as to the second question, I completely agree with Kelly also that the most difficult part of recreating a corridor is the real property. It's not the tracks and ties. Those are, not so difficult to acquire and re-roll or reinstall. It is the land that is essential for preservation. And that's why that's why rail banking is important.
Thanks. And we just want to applaud, your efforts in supporting these policies. I think where, you may have had a reaction when you saw that there are only 3 known rail banked rail trails in Virginia, that seems, pretty minimal. I think when organizations like yours do things like promote these policies at the state level, it can help push state agency involvement in things like rail banking. And in states that have much higher numbers of rail banked corridors, we see state agencies like DOTs and DNRs playing a very active role in rail banking. And that isn't those are circumstances that those agencies have decided to prioritize and have done so for a very long time. But it's really great to see the focus on this by your organization. I'm going to quickly run through my presentation on Rails with Trails, and I will provide a link to several other webinars that go in depth on this topic that I'd encourage you to check out if you're interested in learning more. I wanted to first start off with this map that I quickly pulled from our mapping system. It shows in green trails, that open trails that are a part of our Trail Finder site, TrailLink. The red lines are CSX owned corridors. The blue lines are Norfolk Southern owned corridors. The gray lines are other. This is from the Federal Railroad Administration's GIS data. And I just flashed this on the screen because I think, as trail and rail advocates too, we're always trying to understand what are the opportunities for system connections, right? And a simple statewide map kind of gives you that that visual right away. Of course, it's much more complex, and when you're kind of getting down at the local level to understand how each of these lines connect to each other and what the benefit is to communities. But just thought it would be a good way to start off this section. I wanted to address very quickly the first comment about Rails with Trails are a good idea, but there are only certain areas where physically they can happen. Absolutely, we 100% agree with that. Rails with Trails are just one type of facility that could be available to communities as they look at better connecting their non-motorized transportation and recreation systems. So it's not something that's applicable in every case. And as rail advocates and professionals, I'm sure you can imagine all of the different conditions that would really prohibit a trail from being built within an active rail line. So absolutely agree. Rails with trails, just to be clear on the definition, are shared use paths that are open and developed for public use that are either located on or directly adjacent to an active railroad or rail transit corridor. So that's an important distinction to make, because as we go through some of the following slides, I just want you to note that not all of these trails are located within the actual active right-of-way. Many of them are immediately adjacent. And so that distinction is made in the report that I'll refer to, because there are different kind of planning approaches that you might take based on the location of the corridor relative to the actual right-of-way. The report on the left was produced by the US DOT in partnership with the Volpe Transportation Institute and Rails to Trails Conservancy. It was released this year. We completed the research in 2017, and the report was held in interagency review for several years, but we're really thrilled to have it out there. And again, a lot more details are found in there. I'll try to hit the highlights of questions that were asked, but on the right-hand side of the screen, that's just to note that RTC has been studying Rails with Trails since the early 90s, when we produced our first report in coordination with the National Park Service. And in that time, we've gone from about 60 or so known Rails with Trails to now nearly 400. So we see that it is really a growing phenomena across the US. In the report, we highlight 350 different Rails with Trails in 47 states, totaling about 917 miles. And then RTC continues to track instances of this. We rely on connections with local trail managers to populate information about these trails. You know, in addition to doing some GIS analysis for the Rail with Trail report to indicate where there are segments of Rails with Trails across the country. You have a handful of Rails with Trails in Virginia that we know of. And as, I don't know, some of you that I've spoken with in the past, we're reliant on local communities and trail managers to provide us information. So if we're missing a Rail with Trail segment, please let us know. I'd like to also point out that in our data collection, you know, we have the total length of the trail itself, and then the Rail with Trail segment length. So you can see that typically a trail will be, the full trail length will be longer than the Rail with Trail length. And that, I think, really goes to indicate how this type of facilities can be so useful in making those important connections. So it might not be for, you know, a full segment of right-of-way within a community. It might only kind of touch on a portion of an active rail segment to make that crucial connection within the non-motorized network. These are the benefits and challenges that are outlined in the report. I'm going to just quickly say, you know, that property acquisition is a major challenge. Obviously, concerns about safety and liability are challenges and completely valid concerns on both the railroad side and the trail manager side, and concerns about trespassing go along with that. So we'll address different ways that trail managers and railroads help address those concerns. But, you know, I will say, just kind of going back to my first statement, that there are not always conditions that would allow a trail to be placed safely within an active rail corridor. But we do know of many different design techniques that help address safety. The report outlines perspectives from the railroads, public agencies, and trail managers. We interviewed more than 100 trail managers. Volpe Institute interviewed several Class 1, Class 2 railroad companies, as well as public transit agencies. So I think the main thing that I'll highlight here is just, half of Class 1 railroads have written policies against locating trails within their rights of way. And CSX and Norfolk Southern are two of those Class 1 railroads. It's not to say that there are not existing precedents of where rails with trails exist within those Class 1 railroad corridors. These policies were developed in the 2010s, so may have been a reaction of these types of facilities being built, but rails with trails have an excellent safety record. And like I said, we'll look at a couple of design strategies for minimizing some of those concerns. From the public transportation agency's perspective, few of the agencies have written rail with trail policies, but some are developing them. And I would encourage you, if you're interested, to look in the report. There are a couple good examples from Southern California and Utah that provide not only some policies, but design recommendations as well. Similar concerns related to grade crossings, both on the freight rail and the passenger rail side. Usually the goal of the managing entity or the company is to reduce or eliminate grade crossings. And I just wanted to bring in this really great example of a rail to trail to a rail with trail conversion. This kind of gets along the lines of reactivation, even though this corridor is not a rail banked corridor. It was owned by the transit agency there in Denton County. But it is a story of a corridor that was where rail service was discontinued. A trail was built within the corridor in the, I think, late 90s. And within the past 5 years, the corridor was reestablished for passenger rail, light rail use. So it's an excellent example. And I think this is something we might see more and more as time goes on, right? Where these corridors are being identified for great passenger connections, and the right-of-way here, I think made it the right-of-way width made it easier for all of the stakeholders to work together to achieve their goals of creating new passenger rail service and also still providing that trail connection. From the state DOT's perspectives, there are several states that have written policies related to rails with trails. Again, those are in the report. I think that those are some really great models to look to, where the state agencies are going ahead and creating some guidance, specific to the conditions within that state as well, because there are no federal standards related to design in terms of things like setback and separation. So that sometimes is being handled at the state level. Let's see if I can advance this slide, sorry. And I know we're running short on time. I bring up the updated Pennsylvania State Rail Plan just as an example of a state that has decided to incorporate all of the things that we're talking about today within their updated state rail plan. And I think it's a good model because it is kind of raising the awareness and kind of elevating all of these issues within that planning framework. And it's giving some examples and guidance, that exist within the state already of how each of these things have been successful and how the different rail operators and managing agencies interact with trail managers and communities as well. So I encourage you to check that out. And you know, this is more from our typical partners' perspective. Trail managers really see these as a great opportunity to fill in gaps in networks, it really takes a coordination of many, many stakeholders for these projects to come to fruition. Just a quick look at the trends here. I thought this might be interesting to this group. You see, we kind of have the dark green bars represent the trends within the first 3 or 4 decades of known rail with trail development. And then the lighter green shows from 2000 and beyond. So what you see is a decrease in trails that are located within the actual right of way. And then an increase in both in and out of the right of way. So these are going to be situations where the trail manager likely had to work with either adjacent landowners or maybe with the railroad to purchase excess right of way, situations like that. And then also this slide just demonstrates how there's been kind of a decrease in the number of rails with trails located along freight corridors and an increase in rails with trails located along passenger light rail. I know that we are beyond time. These are several effective practices that are covered in the report that I would encourage you to read. And like I said, we have some other webinars that go into all of these in detail. I did just want to quickly address the setback requirement that I think was a question that came in before the presentation. Like I said, there's no federal standard on minimum setback. There are some agencies that are developing these guidelines based on the conditions of their rail infrastructure. I will say that there are some diagrams in the report too that give you some recommendation for setback and separation based on different conditions within the corridor. So that would be things like the speed of the train, and other existing kind of built environment conditions within the corridor. So there are different scenarios there, but generally I would say in our interviews with more than 100 trail managers, you see a range of setback being anywhere from 100 feet to as little as 10 feet. And again, that just depends on the speed and frequency of the train. All of our information on Rails with Trails is at this URL. It's just railsfortrails.org/railswithtrails. It includes everything that I mentioned. It's a great resource. I know we're at time, so I wanted to get to the end here.
Thank you, Kelly. That was remarkable. And there's so much for us to learn, but you've really helped us get started and continue our thinking and our efforts in developing our policies, at least as an independent analysis and research organization of citizens, our recommendations for policy, and hopefully the state's recommendations too. We are concerned that that there are some interest in one of the potential rails to trails projects that would suggest that there's interest in restoration of rail service probably sooner rather than later. That has been a part of why we are so interested. But as statewide rail policy, it's really important for the State Department of Rail and Public Transportation to continue their examination of rail banking policies, and we very much appreciate that they have done that and are doing it and are developing policies for the state rail plan that will promote rail banking in Virginia. We also are grateful for all the interest in trails and rails with trails in Virginia. And frankly, when I said there were 19 rails to trails, I had no idea that there were actually 51 of them in Virginia. And that's something that is a real eye-opener for us. So thank you very much. We really look forward, hopefully, to all your reports and reading the many things that you've written and provided as tools and information actually for future rails. I want to ask Michael Testerman if he has anything to say before we leave. And again, we are so grateful to you for all the information, for the work you do, and for the contributions you've made to both Rails to Trails and Rails with Trails in your work. Michael?
Ladies, I think you covered almost all of the questions that were asked either during the presentation or within your presentation. There was one, though, that stood out that I just wanted to bring to everyone's attention, and that is what are the qualifications for becoming a trail manager? I think that would be something that we need to be aware of going forward.
So you could think of it as, I mean, I often liken trail development and trail managers to park development and managers, right? So it is really dependent on how each individual community has resources within their community. So many trails are managed by public entities like parks and recreation departments or departments of transportation. Oftentimes trails are kind of the impetus for a trail, and the idea begins with a more like citizen-led grassroots effort that then eventually gets transferred to a public entity that can handle things like filing for rail banking and also raising money to design and construct the trail. So there's not necessarily like a set list of qualifications for a trail manager. And you know, every single trail is different, and the complexities of those corridors might kind of dictate who ultimately ends up being the trail manager. But in terms, and maybe Andrea, I don't know if you want to address this, but just in thinking about who is eligible to rail bank a corridor might also be part of what is the intent of the question.
Sure, and that's a less complicated answer because you really don't have to show any specific capacity to manage or acquire a rail trail in order to file a statement of willingness with the STB to get a rail banking order. And this has been litigated. Opponents have challenged interim trail managers saying, oh, well, they really don't have the assets or the resources to manage the trail. And the STB has said, you know, that's not what we're not going to look at that depth. So being a interim trail manager for STB's purposes is simply being willing to enter into negotiations with the railroad for the acquisition of a rail trail.
That really was helpful. Thank you. I'm going to turn everything back over to Meredith.
Thank you very much. We are extremely grateful for your knowledge and your work and for your being with us today. This has been extremely helpful, and we hope to stay in touch.
Yes. Thank you for the opportunity. And I just dropped my email in the chat. I know that we didn't get to a lot of the questions there, so feel free to reach out if you'd like to. And thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. And thank you, Danny Plugger and Virginians for High Speed Rail for hosting this webinar for the Virginia Rail Policy Institute today. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.